The rain that night sounded like the world was trying to break through my cabin windows. I remember sitting there in my old leather chair, the same one my wife bought when we first moved to this place on Vancouver Island 40 years ago. The fire had almost burned out, my whiskey had gone warm, and I was thinking the same thought that had haunted me for 1,461 days. Where did my son die? Because 4 years earlier, Michael had gone on a ski trip to Whistler and never came back. The police found his ski pole in a crevasse. They found his goggles in the snow, but they never found his body. So eventually, the law did what the law always does. It closed the file, declared him dead, but a father knows when something doesn't make sense. That night, just as the storm got worse, someone knocked on my door. Nobody visits that cabin, not in weather like that. When I opened the door, I saw a man standing in the rain beside a black Mercedes. A man I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. My younger brother, Robert. And the first thing he said to me was, "Get in the car, Thomas. I finally know where Michael is." For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because if what he was saying was true, then the worst 4 years of my life had just turned into something far more terrifying. I hadn't seen my brother Robert in 15 years, and I had planned to keep it that way. The rain poured down his coat as he stood on my porch like a ghost from a life I had buried long ago. "You've got some nerve showing up here," I said. Robert didn't argue, he didn't apologize. He just looked me straight in the eyes and said quietly, "Michael is alive." The world tilted. If you're listening right now, you may recognize that feeling the moment when reality cracks open and nothing feels stable anymore. Because for 4 years I had grieved my son. 4 years of empty birthdays. 4 years of staring at a photograph of him holding his daughter Sophie on the beach. And now my brother, the same brother who once cheated me out of my share of our father's business, was telling me my son was still breathing somewhere. "You have 60 seconds, I told him. "Explain or get off my property." He nodded once. "Get in the car," he said. "Because every minute we stand here is another minute they might move him." That word hit me like a hammer. And suddenly I realized something far worse than grief was about to begin. The Mercedes smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Robert had done well for himself, apparently. That surprised me. The last I had heard, his construction company had collapsed under lawsuits and debt. But none of that mattered right now. I stared at him as he drove down the muddy road toward the highway. "Start talking." Robert kept his eyes on the road. "I've been a private investigator for the last 8 years. That caught my attention. After the business went under," he continued, "I hit rock bottom, lost everything. But I discovered something." "What?" "I'm good at finding people who don't want to be found." He reached into the center console and handed me a thick envelope. "2 years ago," he said, "I started looking into Michael's disappearance." My chest tightened. "You did that for me?" "No," he said quietly. "I did it because something about your daughter-in-law didn't make sense." Claire, Michael's wife, the woman who had remarried 6 months after he was declared dead. Some of you listening probably felt that same uneasy silence I felt right then. Because when grief moves that fast, it usually means something else is hiding underneath. Inside the envelope were bank statements, printed emails, and photographs. At first I couldn't make sense of any of it. Then Robert tapped a page. "Victor Chen," he said. "Claire's new husband." I knew the name. Investment banker, developer, rich. Robert shook his head. "Dirty," he said. "Offshore accounts, shell companies, fraud rumors for years." He pointed to another document. "Michael's company." My stomach dropped. Wire transfers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Moving out of Michael's tech company into shell corporations in Panama and the Cayman Islands. "Embezzlement," Robert said. And Claire was head of finance. My son had built that company from nothing. I remembered him at 25, sitting at my kitchen table with a laptop and a dream. And now someone had been bleeding it dry. Then Robert handed me a printed email. 3 days before Michael disappeared. Subject line: Audit discrepancies, urgent. Michael had discovered the missing money. He was demanding answers, demanding an investigation. And suddenly the mountains didn't look like an accident anymore. They looked like a crime scene. You're telling me they killed my son for money? Robert shook his head slowly. They tried to. That sentence made the car feel 10 degrees colder. They staged the ski accident, he said. Planted the equipment. Made it look like he fell into a crevasse. My throat tightened. Then why is he alive? Robert pulled out his phone. Because they needed to be sure he stayed silent. He handed me the screen. The photograph nearly stopped my heart. A man in a wheelchair, thin, unshaven, staring blankly at a television in a care facility. But I would have recognized that face anywhere. Michael, my son, alive. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Where is he? A private treatment center outside Kelowna, Robert said. They admitted him 4 years ago under a fake name. David Foster. No family. No visitors. Bills paid through a trust connected to Victor Chen. And if you're listening right now, you can probably imagine the storm inside my chest at that moment. Because grief is one thing, but discovering your son has been imprisoned while you mourned him? That's something else entirely. What did they do to him? I asked. Robert's answer made my blood run cold. Sedatives, antipsychotics, benzodiazepines. Enough drugs to keep a person confused and compliant. They told the staff he had a traumatic brain injury. In reality, they were keeping him quiet, keeping him from remembering who he was, or asking the wrong questions. My hands clenched. I'm going to kill them. I meant it. But Robert shook his head firmly. No, he said. We're going to destroy them. With evidence. With prosecutors. With prison. He looked at me carefully. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting Michael out. We were 3 hours from Kelowna. And if Victor Chen suspected someone was investigating, Michael might not stay alive much longer. That realization hit me like ice water. So I said the only thing a father could say in that moment. Tell me what I need to do. We planned the rescue during the drive. Robert had spent a week watching the facility, learning routines, security, shift changes. Visiting hours end at 8, he explained. Shift change at 9. That would be our window. He had forged documents identifying us as relatives of David Foster, a long-lost brother, DNA ancestry connection, authorization from the trust administrator. Most facilities don't question paperwork, Robert said. They assume the lawyers already did. Still, everything could collapse with one suspicious phone call. As we crossed the mountain pass, the rain finally stopped. Stars appeared above the dark road. I stared out the windshield thinking about Sophie, my granddaughter, 8 years old. If her mother went to prison, Sophie would come live with me. I hadn't held that little girl in almost 2 years. That thought settled heavily in my chest. And if you're listening tonight, tell me something. Would you have gotten in that car? Or would you have stayed home, afraid it was all a lie? The care facility looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Soft lighting, large windows, perfect landscaping. The kind of place wealthy families hide inconvenient problems. Robert walked confidently to the front desk. Good evening, he said. We're here to see David Foster. The receptionist checked the documents. My pulse hammered in my ears. If she called the trust administrator, everything was over. She typed something into the computer, then smiled. Of course, visiting hours end soon, but you may see him briefly. Relief nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. She led us through quiet hallways. Wheelchairs. Patients staring into space. Lives paused halfway through. Margaret, my wife, had spent her final weeks in a place like this. I hated the smell of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. But nothing prepared me for what waited in the common room. Because sitting beside a window, watching television with empty eyes, was my son. Michael looked thinner than I remembered. His beard had grown long and uneven. His hands rested limp in his lap. The television played a nature documentary, but his eyes weren't really watching it. They were drifting somewhere far away. Robert squeezed my arm gently. Slowly, he whispered. We walked over. Robert pulled up a chair. David, he said softly. My name is Robert. This is Thomas. We're your family. Michael turned his head slowly. His eyes moved like they were underwater. I don't remember, he mumbled. Don't remember anything. Those words nearly shattered me. I knelt beside him anyway, took his hand. It was cold and weak. Michael, I whispered. It's Dad. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. His fingers twitched. Dad? Then confusion washed over his face again. They said I don't have a dad. That lie cut deeper than anything else that night. Someone's coming, Robert whispered. A man in a white coat was walking toward us quickly. Perfect hair. Expensive watch. Dr. Harrison, the attending physician. I wasn't informed David had visitors, he said sharply. Robert stood calmly. We have authorization. The doctor looked at Michael, then back at us. You seem very invested in his condition. I stepped forward before Robert could answer. That's because you've been drugging my son for 4 years. The doctor's expression froze. For the first time, he looked afraid, and that fear told me everything I needed to know. Dr. Harrison's hand moved toward his phone. Robert reacted faster. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the doctor's wrist and twisted it gently behind his back, not enough to hurt him, but enough to make the message clear. Careful, Robert said quietly. His voice was calm, almost polite, but there was steel underneath it. I've been recording this entire conversation. The doctor froze. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Robert pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward him. And copies of our evidence, he continued, have already been sent to the RCMP, the Securities Commission, and 3 investigative journalists. Dr. Harrison's face lost all its color. For a moment, nobody spoke. Michael sat in his wheelchair beside me, staring vaguely at the television. Still drugged, still confused, but alive. I kept my hand on his shoulder, because after 4 years of believing he was dead, I wasn't letting go again. You're bluffing, the doctor said, but his voice wasn't steady. Not even close. Robert gave a small shrug. Maybe, he said. Then he nodded toward the window. Red and blue lights flickered faintly in the distance. Police sirens. Getting closer. And suddenly the doctor understood something important. This secret he had helped protect for 4 years was finally collapsing. Dr. Harrison stepped back slowly. You don't understand what you're doing, he muttered. But no one believed him. Not Robert. Not me. Because men who are innocent don't panic when the police arrive. Robert released his wrist. Go sit in your office, he said calmly. And wait. For a second, I thought the doctor might try something stupid. Run. Call someone. Warn Victor Chen. But he didn't. He simply turned and walked away, shoulders tight with fear. The receptionist approached us nervously. Is everything all right? She asked. Robert gave her a reassuring smile. There's been a medical review request, he said. The RCMP will explain shortly. She nodded, though confusion filled her eyes. I didn't waste another second. I moved behind Michael's wheelchair. Come on, son, I whispered. We're getting you out of here. His head turned slowly toward me. Home? He murmured. That single word nearly broke me. Yes, I said quietly. Home. Outside, the night air felt cold and clean. I pushed his wheelchair across the parking lot just as the first police cruiser pulled in. Lights flashing, sirens fading. For the first time in 4 long years, someone was finally coming to help my son. The parking lot quickly filled with police vehicles. Officers moved with calm efficiency, speaking into radios and securing the building. Detective Sarah Nguyen stepped out of one of the cruisers. She looked sharp, focused, the kind of person who had seen too many terrible things to be easily surprised. Robert handed her a folder. All the evidence is in there, he said. Bank records, emails, medical documentation, everything. She skimmed through the papers quickly. Then she looked up at us. You two understand you've technically broken several laws tonight. I didn't even blink. I'll pay every fine you can think of, I said. Just promise me the people responsible for this go to prison. She studied my face for a moment. Then she nodded. With this evidence, she said, tapping the folder, they're going away for a very long time. Paramedics arrived and began examining Michael, checking his pupils, his pulse, the medications in his bloodstream. One of them looked at me with quiet sympathy. He's been heavily sedated for years, she said, but there's no sign of permanent brain damage. Those words felt like oxygen after drowning, because hope had been gone from my life for a long time. But suddenly, it was back. They took Michael to Kelowna General Hospital. I rode in the ambulance beside him, watching the monitors, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Every so often his eyes opened slightly, unfocused but searching. "Dad?" he murmured once. I squeezed his hand gently. "I'm right here." Those 3 words were something I had dreamed about for years. The doctors ran tests through the night. Blood panels, neurological scans, medication analysis. Around 3 in the morning, a neurologist finally spoke with me. Your son has been given extremely high doses of antipsychotics and sedatives, she explained. That's why he appeared cognitively impaired. But the good news is, his brain itself is healthy. I felt my knees go weak. With proper detox and time, she continued, he should recover most of his mental clarity. 4 years stolen, but not his future. When they finally let me into his hospital room, Michael was awake. He looked tired, but his eyes were clearer than before. "Hey, Dad," he said softly. And just like that, my son was back. The first thing Michael asked about wasn't the investigation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't money. It was Sophie. "My daughter," he whispered. "Is she okay?" I sat beside his hospital bed and nodded. "She's 8 now. Smart. Funny. Just like you were at that age." He closed his eyes briefly. Tears slipped quietly down the side of his face. "I tried to remember her," he said, "but the drugs made everything fuzzy. Sometimes I could see her face. Then it would disappear again. If you've ever been separated from someone you love, you know how fragile memories can feel. And for 4 years, someone had been slowly stealing those memories from my son. I kept trying to stay awake," he said, "trying to remember my life. But every time I started to understand something was wrong, they increased the medication." His voice cracked slightly. "How long was I gone?" 4 years, I told him. The room fell silent. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then we've got a lot of catching up to do." And hearing him say that, I realized something important. They had stolen years from him, but they hadn't broken him. Robert appeared in the hospital doorway just before sunrise. He looked exhausted. His jacket was wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. For a moment he stood there awkwardly, unsure whether he should enter. After 15 years of silence between us, that hesitation made sense. Michael noticed him immediately. "Uncle Robert," he said. His voice was still weak, but warm. Robert walked slowly into the room. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you," he said. Michael shook his head gently. "You found me," he replied. "That's what matters." Robert looked at me. Something quiet passed between us. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The kind of moment where old anger starts to loosen its grip. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive with dramatic speeches. Sometimes it just shows up quietly, in a hospital room at dawn. And if this story feels familiar to you, that's a familiar silence. The kind families carry for years before finally deciding to speak again. 2 weeks later, I brought Sophie to the hospital. She held my hand tightly as we walked down the hallway. Her small fingers trembled. "What if he doesn't remember me?" she asked. "He does," I said gently. He never forgot you. Michael was sitting upright when we entered the room. The doctors had trimmed his beard. Color had returned to his face. He looked thinner, older, but unmistakably himself. When he saw Sophie, everything changed. His entire face softened. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered. Sophie froze for a second. Then she ran forward. "Daddy!" She wrapped her arms around his neck and began crying. Michael held her tightly, like someone who had been drowning and had finally reached shore. I stepped quietly into the hallway to give them space. Robert stood beside me there. We watched through the window, and neither of us said a word. Because sometimes there are moments too important for conversation. Claire Chen and Victor Chen were arrested the same week. Fraud, embezzlement, kidnapping, identity theft, false imprisonment. The charges kept stacking up. Dr. Harrison accepted a plea deal and agreed to testify against them, which meant the prosecutors now had everything they needed. The care facility itself was shut down for investigation. Authorities began reviewing patient files, because once investigators started asking questions, it became clear something larger might be hiding there. When systems operate without scrutiny, people disappear, and sometimes it takes one case to expose the rest. If you're listening right now, I'm curious about something. What would you have done in my place? Would you have trusted your brother after 15 years? Or would you have walked away? Sometimes the quiet choices we make change everything. Michael moved into my cabin while he recovered. Some nights were difficult. He would wake suddenly, disoriented, certain he was still trapped in that facility. But slowly, things improved. The doctors reduced his medications. His mind became sharper each week. Robert started visiting most weekends, bringing groceries, helping Michael sort through legal documents, and spending hours fishing with Sophie off the dock. Watching the two of them laugh together felt surreal. For 4 years, I believed my family had been destroyed. But now, piece by piece, it was rebuilding itself. Sometimes life doesn't return what it took, but sometimes it gives you something different, something quieter, something stronger. And if you understand quiet strength, you belong here. Real power moves in silence. Subscribe. Because stories like this aren't about revenge. They're about dignity. One evening in early autumn, we sat together on the porch. The sun was setting over the water. Sophie was half asleep beside Michael. Robert leaned back in his chair, holding a cold beer. For a long time, none of us spoke. Then Michael broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what comes next." I turned toward him. "No rush," I said. "You've already survived more than enough." He nodded. "I know, but I don't want what happened to me to happen to someone else." He explained his idea, helping families search for missing relatives, working with investigators, exposing wrongful commitments. Robert smiled slightly. "I know people in that world," he said. "I can introduce you." Michael looked out at the water. "I spent 4 years losing my life," he said quietly. "I'm not wasting the rest of it." Sophie stirred beside him. "You'll still come home, right?" she asked sleepily. Michael kissed the top of her head. "Always. 4 years earlier, I believed my life had ended. My son gone. My wife gone. My family broken. But that night on the porch, watching the sunset with all of them beside me, I understood something. Life doesn't always return things the way they were. Sometimes it rebuilds them differently." Michael leaned back in his chair, Sophie asleep against his shoulder, Robert staring quietly out at the ocean. None of it was perfect. There were still scars, still memories we would spend years unpacking. But we were together, and sometimes that's enough. If this story reached you tonight, I'd like to know something. Tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from? Across cities, across countries, people are hearing stories like this and realizing they're not alone. Stand where integrity stands. Silence can be powerful. Stand with us. And remember this: the world sometimes tries to erase people, But as long as someone refuses to stop searching, the truth eventually finds its way home.